conversation in relation to new literacy. So maybe we could just thank everybody for particularly our international guests who have come from a long way away to contribute to the conversation and help us think more broadly and deeply about issues that we've been working on, but also to those of you that have come from across Canada, which is sometimes as neat a feat as coming from international spaces, and to the local people who have carved out time to come and be participants in this discussion, because without all of you, that wouldn't be as rich as it has been. So we want to thank you very much for your contributions. Just have a couple of housekeeping things before I turn it over to Teresa to begin the reformed panel. First of all, lunch is at 12. This will finish at 12, and then there will be lunch. Bonnie Norton has kindly offered to take a little jaunt to the beach, if anybody, particularly
clothing optional.
Visitors. If anybody is interested, would you connect with Bonnie at 12 o'clock, and then that will be organized. That will. She will ensure that as many people are as willing will come back at 1:30. She won't drag anybody back, but the willing ones will be back at 1:30 where we'll reconvene. And the afternoon, 1:30 to about 3 o'clock, what we're trying to do is pull some of these things together into a bit of a product in process. So a working document that tries to capture some of the issues, some of the questions, some of the understandings that we have brought to this discussion in relation to new literacies in a Canadian context. We think that there's a lot that Canadians have to offer to this conversation, and we'd like to put together some kind of a working document that could be more publicly circulated. So we thought if it started here, we would find ways to then disseminate it to other groups, because obviously these are not the only voices in Canada relating that do work in new literacies. But then have something that we can then work from and carry forward. We know there have been small conversations about where the next iteration of this might go. And before we finish today, it might be a good idea for people to share that, so we know how we can be helpful in anybody planning on doing some hosting in the future. And I know there are things in the works. So at approximately 3 o'clock, we'll wrap up that part of the, which is the final part of the workshop. And then, as you probably know, Teresa has kindly opened her home to a wine and cheese reception. There's a map, and there will be people walking over to her place starting at 3:30-ish and lasting until something-ish.
And I know there are people that are already going out to dinner to airports, but you can stay as long as you need to stay.
Just one more reminder about the blog. Please feel free to send, and if you can't upload to the blog, send to any one of us and we can upload to the blog any of the working documents that you would be prepared to share, PowerPoints, draft papers, things that will help us continue the conversation and keep connected with each other.
We'll also probably send an email out maybe in the next week or so to request some biographical information so that we can create a little bit more information about the participants, and hopefully we'll be a resource to you as well, some more context.
And Lisa just has a word about receipts.
I actually don't have a word about receipts. I said just a little bit. I just wanted to thank everybody for the opportunity to be involved, and I know myself and some of the other graduate students who are here found this to be a very rewarding experience, and certainly appreciate the generosity that everyone has shown and the insights that you shared. But this wouldn't have happened had Maureen and Kathy and Teresa put it all together. So we just wanted to take this opportunity to acknowledge all the efforts that they put in way ahead of us being here, and to say thank you very much. And we just have a little you can fight over the color.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
It has been a long but great privilege on my part.
Okay, so, this panel, we keep rethinking what this panel is, so we'll see what it turns into. And the students are delighted, they don't look as delighted as they are, to actually start us out. And what they, as you know, their job has been to be at one of the groups for the entire time and to be taking down notes and uploading them on blog, because not everybody's been cooperative. It's like an assignment that everybody's been avoiding, which is fine. But they've done it, and so what they're gonna do is they're gonna share from each group some of the really kind of one or two interesting issues. They don't wanna be up for more than 5 minutes, they said to us. So, and then if your group wants to add a thing, something, that's great too. And then after that, we're gonna turn it over to John Willinsky, who's going to give this wonderful overview of the entire 2.5 days. No, in his way, and say a few things, and then depending on time, we'll just look it up. I think that might work, I realize it. So, should we just launch right into it? And so I guess we'll, Kim, I'm sorry, you're group one. We'll start with you.
I have to say, the level of collective inquiry just going on in our group alone makes what I'm going to try to do almost impossible. But so I can just imagine as we try to put all this together. So it's really quite exciting. So I'm just going to lay out a couple of ideas that we seem to come to towards the end, and then invite the rest of my group to add to that, extend it, challenge it, whatever. So really in the end, we realized that we were really coming down to these big questions of what are the goals, or what is the goal of this work in new literacies. And so often we came to discussions around needs to encourage processes of analysis, synthesis, but most important, critique in this new literacies work with students of a range of ages. And so we came to this question of what is it that we mean by being critical. Is it in the everyday world, at sites of production? Is it something that's much larger? Which led to an even bigger question around this project. Is it a project of pedagogy? Is it a project of citizenship? I think we said, yeah. And Julian a number of times has brought out this idea of this is really a progressivist project of digital literacies. I'm just gonna slow down here. Digital literacies really do well in carrying forward a progressivist project, but we have this tendency to think of digital literacies as equalizing, and the question that kept coming up in our group again and again is it? And as Mastin pointed out last night, because of its situated nature of literacies in general, it simply isn't an equalizing project. So then this question of are all literate activities equal? The kinds of things that we have students doing, students of all ages, do they all count in the same ways in terms of moving students forward, in terms of social justice, in terms of the students' ability to walk or talk, operate within codes of power. Let me just read what I've written here. I can't even remember. Through the project that is the New Literacy Studies, in our effort to show that all things have literate qualities, having meaning doesn't necessarily mean that all literacies are the same. So there's this idea that literacy has always been exclusive. So the agenda that digital literacy then brings into the equation is really quite bizarre in the sense, because where it comes from the democratic impulse, it flies in the face of exclusive school literacies. It still has this sort of dividing activity to it. So then we began to talk in a sort of summative way about the political rhetoric around upward mobility and democratic notions of school. what are schools offering kids in relation to social justice contract, and in turn, what do digital literacies offer to schools? We often came back to schools, and this idea that this is where kids are spending huge proportions of the day, and so if thinking democracy, thinking social justice, that so much of it comes down to where young people are spending their time. So rhetoric, though, around the democratizing nature of digital literacies is very often different from what happens in practice. So we also spoke then about these kinds of disjunctures where we've got parents and teachers who are looking for answers, but then as time goes on and they begin working with some of the digital literacies or the new ideas, ideologies, or maybe even old practices around, what is good learning. The new discourses are challenged. Parents, teachers often sort of revert back to some old ways of thinking about what literacy is and what learning is. And so we were kind of left with this question that idealism has in some ways become a bit of a burden for teachers. And so how do we then become, to use, I think it was Julian's word, robust about how we move these pedagogies forward, how we continue to encourage teachers to engage with these new practices and with the larger goals of these practices, larger goals of the universities. So I'm going to leave it at that, and jump in, group.
Anybody want to add anything from group one, or hold off and wait till you're off?
Okay, so I was with group 2. Many different projects presented throughout the 2 days. A lot of them were international, multi-site projects, so we had a lot of questions, a lot of issues about how to look at the products on those different sites, how to analyze them, and also how the new technology, not just the digital, but we talked about video and photos and everything, how do they offer new possibilities? There was some interesting expression that came up in some of the session, how some of the kids were playing out different identities because they had those camera, those new tools. They were positioning themselves, they were becoming mentally modernized, but the technology needs to be available, and there's also the new social identity also needs to be available. We can't create from anything. So just the technology is not, the tool itself is not the answer. It's one of the tools that can lead them forward, but everything has to be available for them as well. The fact that it was a lot of multi-site international projects, and that some of the projects were carried from one place to another, so videos made in Kenya might be showed in Canada and vice versa. And there were questions about what the messages, what the meaning were in those videos, in those products, and what the students in Canada were getting out of the products, the videos from Kenya, and how there could be multiple meanings. And we talk about being critical. So the first thing that the kids will see might not be the only meaning, but then you can go further with them and talk with them about what are the other meanings, what were the people in Kenya, I'm using Kenya, but it could be any other sites, put in that video that is meaningful to them, not just to you as a Canadian in a classroom, but to them as well. We talked a lot about knowledge as well, how in those projects, who is producing knowledge, for whom, and how is the knowledge being used. We talked about maintaining data. We do these videos in these projects, then we leave. What do we leave to the community? Not just leaving a token benefit, but how can you maintain and archive this data so that it's useful to the community? And throughout the presentation, we talked about keeping process data as well. So the kids are taking pictures. You get the pictures of data, but taking pictures of the kids taking pictures as well. And how is it useful? We're not exactly sure, but there's lots of things that could come out of the process as well. Not just the product, but the process of creating the product as well. We had some conversation also with one project about L1, first language, having kids using their first language, sharing a poem or text, and how the problem was often that didn't really know what their L1 was, or they didn't want to share in that L1, so the tool, the new technology, was not enough to bring them to use that symbolic linguistic resource that we, as researchers, we thought was really important, but the kids were not seeing it the same way. And we have also ended up with a lot of really rich data, lots of videos from different sites, lots of products, but how do we analyze them? How do we look at them? We talked about, are we looking at the media, the video itself? Because we're not media, we're in education, it's not media study. It's not only that, so how do we look and analyze? What are the tools that could be useful once the video is made? And how can we help the kids go further than, okay, I made a video, it's really cute, I showed it to my dad, he liked it, and what else? It comes back to being critical, not just using the tool, but being also critical and going forward with that.
I'm tempted to say ditto. I'm lucky to go last, I think. So I'm just going to give you a couple of themes that cut across, and I may overlap a little bit with what you've already said. I won't go into the details too much. So one thing that we talked a lot about over the last 2 days was teachers' challenges with digital literacy, digital technologies, and the ways that we prepare children to participate online, and the ways we support pre-service teachers, and how we can look more into that. That's still really, even though I think we make lots of assumptions about what people can and can't do, that's something we really need to look at more closely, and to think about that. And also another key idea that people talked about was play, and how we can think about play differently, how you might contrast our conventional notion of play and playing online, and how the constraints or affordances of particular kinds of online tools might affect how we play. Also, this dichotomy of traditional school literacies and media literacies, even though it's something we're trying to trouble, it seems to come up over and over. It seems to be really embedded in the way we think about literacy, so that's something we can focus on more. Another session focused on the importance of also troubling digital representations, like we often valorize the things that children produce, or even the things that they interact with online. So how can we look at those in more complicated ways? Another thing we also talked about was time, how we often don't spend the time. We're often sampling, in a sense, we're doing those remixes, but we're also sampling digital technologies and tools and engaging with children in ways that are often superficial, and ourselves also. Just not taking the time and the space to get to engage more deeply. And then for myself, and this really repeats something that Kim already said, is all the assumptions about access that we continue to make. I think when we're talking about always digital, isn't that? From my own personal experience in working with children, the idea that children have access to digital technologies is not really, even in the North American context, is not really true if you look across socioeconomic groups or that sort of thing. So I think it's something that we could think about a little bit more. So those are the broad themes.
So, John.
Yes, I actually just got a note in terms of the interference or the play of technology that said that Andrew didn't want to film the back of my head, and that I shouldn't just sit there and I could do myself. I actually think it's my best side, but what will,
Do you want to sit here?
I think as a teacher we should stand, so I'm going to take the position of standing. You did such a nice job in the summaries, Genevieve and Diane and Kim. I'm not sure. In fact, I think I've been relieved of that responsibility. So let me talk to you more about our responsibilities in terms of the statement for this afternoon and for the rest of our lives. Just to keep it modest, Teresa always sets very high standards, and I thought I would speak to that. And because one thing that perhaps didn't get as much time as I had expected when I first got here is our own literacies. That what is real for us, and reality was very much an issue. The ontology of literacy is a question. That is the reality status of it, and in particular digital literacies. And we heard much about the state of children in various ways in terms of working with technology. And we were given these reductive snapshots not reductive, sampling, that was a lovely term. Sampling snapshots of kids' experience, but the reality, the thing that we do know and live is our own literacies. And that literacy is very much us. We made reference to clerical literacy and Latin literacy, and that is us. And so that we have a legacy, we have a commitment, we have an ownership issue around literacy that is very much at stake. And so the question may be just as much about what we're doing with our literacy going forward than it is about the kids. It may be just as much about what is new in terms of our literacy. And that part of the caution we have to take is that we don't treat literacy as something that is real, that exists, and we just have to discover it. That we just have to sit closely with the kids, listen carefully, and have all of our recorders on as the kids speak to us, when in fact we are always going to be the ones who write that literacy. There isn't anything that a child is going to say to us or do for us that is going to define literacy. It's going to be something that falls on us. And if you think about the term, in education it hasn't had a long life. And in fact, illiteracy is the older term. I've always loved that. It's the negative that is the older term, illiteracy. And that literacy is just a matter of letters. That literacy is based on a notion of having letters. And that was a very important distinction at one point, because it could exonerate you in terms of having to face the courts. If you could plead clergy, if you had letters, and you were a member of the clergy, then you were subject only not to civil courts, not to capital punishment, as it were, but to the church courts, where they did not. They did many things that made you uncomfortable, but they did not actually execute. There were some burnings, I know. It was not part of canon law. So let's stay with the present. So this idea then that our responsibility, or maybe our temptation, is to name new literacies. And I can say that because I'm sure you've all done at least one paper on new literacies. I did a book on new literacies, and I was very pleased with the title until I saw almost immediately that someone had done it 20 years before me, and now it's 20 years after that. And so this idea that our job, our work with literacy, is to create and name and identify categories around this practice. And so it isn't for us to discover, it is for us to set an agenda. It is for us to arrive at a program. It is for us to decide what we can contribute and add in that terrible business cliche, or not even cliche, but phrase of added value. And so this idea of need and drive for our contribution, I think, is something that I think you should focus on, and that would be appropriate for this afternoon in terms of thinking about an agenda, a research agenda. And that is actually consistent with the research grant. We could talk about our funders. We are here by virtue of the grace of the state, by virtue of SSHRC in its infinite wisdom, having second thoughts about the value of this project. Which, and I haven't had that experience, but wasn't that a delightful way? Yeah, so you never appreciate something so much as when it isn't given to you and then given to you as a surprise. So we should be all the more grateful and all the quicker to find a way of repaying what for SSHRC is an investment in a very simple and basic experience of coming face to face and of inspiring each other, particularly around research direction. SSHRC's investment in these workshops is to create a synergy, or whatever term you want to use, but is to drive forward the research project, the quality of knowledge. And so that our work going forward around what we are framing here as new literacies is to think about what is in the value of the new and what can we contribute to that sense of newness, if it is the case. I want to suggest that with digital literacies, it would be foolish and naive to think that we're going to be able to know it and name it. That it is clearly too current. That we are 20, 30, how many years into this age, and that we would somehow be able to put our finger on it, is in itself terribly naive. And then I'm also suggesting, a kind of philosophical position, that there isn't anything there. A Gertrude Stein position. There's no there. With literacies, it's only what we write and make of it. So this idea then that the divisions that we create between digital and non-digital, between in-school and out-of-school, between formal and informal learning, all have to have a purpose. It's as if the rule I want to suggest to you is that there can be no division unless that division has a purpose that you can demonstrate the good out of it. That there is something missing, something that needs to be addressed, and that this division that you are making, whether it's formal, informal, net generation, post-net generation, those distinctions need to be driven by a particular sense of purpose. It's a utilitarian, if you like, theory of language. That the function of our literacy, the purpose and drive of our literacy, and we have a certain force. Not as much as we would like, not a particularly direct to policy, except in the case of Ben Levin, but most of us don't have that sense of ability to drive policy, but we are a force. Generations of teachers carry some part of us. I don't want to imagine how big it is. Some part of us, where's Kim? Some part of us forward. And so this idea then of how we use this particular literacy we have, and how we decide that there are things that are needed in this particular context. I'm not saying we should ignore that. That the digital aspect of the age, that the idea that students are engaged in the exchange of letters in a way that they weren't perhaps when we were growing up, and that the age of correspondence has been reborn, is something that we want to think about in terms of what we can contribute. And I've got just a few suggestions around that. But in this context, this notion that we tend to romanticize, or we tend to take an anthropological position on description, even that has to be driven by a sense that there is a value that it contributes, that we are gaining something by romanticizing certain teacher and child interactions, that we are gaining something by carefully observing the exchange of information because there is a need and that it will contribute in a way that we can justify. Justify around issues of democracy, justify around issues of marginalization, justify around issues of inequality that need to be addressed. So this idea then let me take just a few agenda-setting points. The constant return to the informants, that the childs are our informants. One that I've already kind of called into question, but there is a Shirley Bryce Heath answer to this, if I can go back a decade or two. There is a sense in which we could co-investigate with our students. That what we need to develop is a framework, that we're good at making distinctions and frameworks and setting up, as it were, genres for students to participate in, but that we can co-investigate. That we can say that our expertise in these areas is not as great as the students who stand before us, and that this hasn't happened in too many situations. It didn't happen in calculus, at least in my class, but it may be happening with the use of technologies, and that we can co-investigate with students, but even then, we would want to say there's a reason for this, that we're not going to name the truth of digital literacy. What we're going to say is, how is this literacy being used in ways that concern us, in ways that have to do with gum chewing. Where did I?
Yes.
Oh, gum chewing, yes. That have to do with rules and authority and gum chewing. That have to do with the distribution of power in our school. That have to do with inequalities around bullying and the climate of our classroom. And so even then, when we co-investigate, when we take on a Heathian notion of the children as ethnographers, we have a sense of purpose and drive and direction around that. A further aspect of this is a concept of service learning. Let's take our literacy as faculty members, as graduate students, as a service. Is there a way in which we can define our literacy? A way in which we can move forward that we can see more directly? Now that I've relieved you of the responsibility, you no longer have to name the truth of digital literacies. You no longer have to identify the true qualities of the net generation. You're relieved of that. What you now have to do is think about how the literacy you are writing about is going to make the world a better place in some small, incremental way. And even if that is to just represent some aspect of that world a little more accurately, I don't want to be anti-intellectual about this. I don't want to say it has to be utilitarian in a direct way that it makes someone's life better at every instance. There is some value in a more accurate description of the world, but even then, that description, that need for a description has to be defended. You need to justify why this gap that needs to be described, it adds value in terms of understanding why that representation has been missing, why something has been overlooked, and why it hasn't been covered otherwise. There's a sense of assumptions that we can provide in terms of that service. So think about that service as identifying an audience. It's always helpful when you're writing to have an audience. Do you remember that? In terms of whether it's teachers, and I want to come back to teachers in a moment and put a little more emphasis on that. But think about parents and think about policymakers and think about others who are concerned about this digital technology. The idea that these technologies are doing serious damage in ways they may not be doing, or may be doing damage in ways people aren't realizing, that of bringing your work to bear on that, of investigating with the students, or not necessarily, but that's certainly an aspect that's possible, to say that there are certain assumptions about the impact of this technology. Schools' access policies would be a very good example of that. The way that schools will sometimes clamp down on access to whether it's Facebook or whether it's the internet as a whole or other elements would be ones that we can say, well, what is the problem exactly? And then let's test that. Let's put that to the test. Who is at risk here? And what is the trade-off in terms of access to knowledge and the qualities that we, sorry, Andrew.
Yes.
Excuse me. And the qualities that we are very concerned, you feel the breath. The qualities that we are concerned about. Let me take this idea of service and teachers for a second, because teachers have figured in our talk, but not in a way that I was, at least I want to ask for more from. The professionalism of teachers today is under assault. It was always a question. It was always a struggle in terms of the professionalism of teachers, and BCTF in this province is one of the, can certainly claims, one of its proudest aspects is that it has contributed greatly. That it has always been concerned about curriculum, it has always been concerned about issues of fairness and equality for students, as well as about monetary and other sorts of more traditional federation things. But that professionalism, that position of teachers is something that we should be serving. That we should be thinking about how our work can contribute to that. And what it is about the teacher's relationship, because they are caught to a certain degree in terms of their responsibilities around technology, in terms of how the outside world and the risks are invading the classroom. At the same time as a great wealth of knowledge that's available in every classroom in a way that never was. That was in the school library, certainly, but that wasn't in the individual classrooms. And so this ability to contribute to teachers in terms of the arguments that they can use, research that they can bring and put on the table of the school board, that says we don't have any money for new novels is one of the things that came up this morning, that we have to read Lord of the Flies again, that we can help teachers more directly in terms of their role as leaders of education and not simply as the servants following scripts in terms of the state. Finally, this idea of causes, of a particular focus, I want to think for a second about it. It came up repeatedly, this idea that technology has a democratic aspect to it, that there's a potential for a democratization. And I think we caution that in some cases in terms of an overriding, that once you have the tools, then you have the democracy. But that very concern gives it a focus. That is that if these tools, if you have a sense that the tools are contributing to something in terms of the distribution of power, then what does that look like? And when are you most confident that it is working in that way? And how can you provide a stronger case for that happening more often in school and other educational settings? So this ability to focus in and make decisions. You will not be able to cover the whole of the world. You have a limited, at least some of us do, have limited abilities to apply in terms of our research agendas, in terms of the sponsorship that we have, the privilege that we have in terms of conducting research, thanks to SHRC and other kinds of support. And so that we need to decide exactly what is the nature of that democratic potential and how in some way can we advance that. What is the aspect of social equality that's being introduced? And I'm one that is taken by that, even if it is at the cell phone level, that there is a distribution of potential expression, participation, and even family networking in terms of social support and social capital that is being realized. And I want to look for ways. I want to look for ways of doing research, of defining literacy, of defining what is new about literacy in ways that contributes to that, in ways that I can feel confident, although with research you sometimes have to adjust and change your ideas about that. Finally, this intellectual and historical aspect. So the agenda, I've been political in this element up to now in terms of social justice and democratization. even the professionalism of teachers. Two more points. One is this intellectual one, this idea that we are a part of a history. And I was very pleased in this conference certainly to see, and I'm sure all of us enjoyed, the elements of history that were introduced. The reminder about Latin, that we're at a certain point in terms of a kind of evolving clerisy between lay literacy and Latin literacy. So this idea that we can begin to both draw on older ideas, that we can go back to Elizabeth Eisenstein's work on the impact of print, and we can use that as a way of framing what's going on, not that we can know it in any confident historical sense, but that we can be part of that documentation, part of that bringing forward of a framework. And it's a highly speculative element, but I think it's worthwhile. So on the one hand, I am saying that we cannot name that literacy. It doesn't exist apart from our naming, as it were. It's a kind of projection. At the same time, we can use earlier historical projections to provide a little more of a framework. And certainly in working with students of education students and students in the high schools, not the elementary schools, we can begin to give them some of that historical perspective as well. The final element in terms of a cause is one that I have been very heartened by in the discussion that's been going on, and that's this art and craft idea. That digital literacies have a lot of labor involvement, and that part of the motivation, we are very drawn by fun. Fun in all kinds of aspects, whether it's in sexual orientation or whether it's in production of videos. But the idea that fun is an element here, we're all kind of keen about. We used to think these things on the walls were fun, not so much maybe, but the idea that we're going to tap into that art and craft. And the motivational element is very much about an absorption of time and energy and labor, so that students can go a greater distance, that they can produce something of value to others, which I was talking about earlier in our group, that they can produce something of value to others through this technology provides a very strong pedagogical focus. It provides a way of saying that why I'm engaged in this use of technology is because the students are producing, and here are my cases. It's a wonderful sense in which the accountability, the audit society that we live in is looking for an account of what we're doing, and we say, well, I can give you this number, or I can show you what the child has done. You, parent, decide. Here's the number, and here's the work the child has done that will be a part of your family's legacy. Yeah, blah, blah, blah. Oh, okay. Probably for me. It's time to go. I time to close it up. Let me just finish with the two little anecdotes in terms of this historical aspect. Two elements just to caution us around this. One is with Martin Luther. So the idea of
Excuse me. That's for it's Martin. Yes, a few things to
ask
say.
not for whom. So Martin Luther had this wonderful experience in terms of public broadcasting systems. And this is a bit apocryphal. But when Martin Luther traveled through Europe to, as it were, reform the church and to divide the world in ways that had very much to do with literacy, very much to do with the right to read the Bible, very much had to do with each person that had the ability to interpret the world. He had this lovely experience of showing up and giving sermons in town after town in Europe. And he had this, at first he didn't quite believe it, but what he would see is people's lips would be moving as he spoke. And what he realized after a while is they were lip-syncing his sermons because they had been printed and they had been circulated and posted on the walls of the outside walls of the churches, and then were torn down very quickly by the priest, and then reposted, and that everyone knew the word, and that it had in fact spread in a way that was welcomed way ahead of anything he could, any kind of distance or travel that he could achieve in terms of reaching these communities. And this idea of how a broadcasting system against, with a very sliver of the technology compared to what we're looking at now, had a way of changing the world around this very issue of rights. And I'm not suggesting that everything that happened went all that well with that, but I am suggesting that it is an encouraging instance. The other one I would give you is Isaac Newton. The literacy story with Isaac Newton is slightly later, a century or two, in the 1670s. Isaac Newton, as a young scholar, holds the Lucasse chair in his early 20s, and there's this new phenomenon that happens. This is a little closer to our own hearts here. This new phenomenon is called Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society, edited by Henry Oldenburg. The Royal Society will not approve it, but allows its transactions to be published, and this is essentially the first journal in English. And Isaac Newton is curious about it. He sees it, but you know that Isaac Newton's personality. He's a rather, shall we say, retentive kind of person, given to secrecy, and very reluctant to go out into the world. But he's intrigued by this new phenomenon. There had only been scientific books up to this time, and this is essentially a news book, a 16-page pamphlet recording the events and occurrences of the Royal Society, the weekly meetings and presentations. And so he submits. He's convinced by the editor, who is a hustler. The editor is doing it for profit, I have to be honest with you. He's trying to make 50 pounds, Henry Oldenburg's trying to make 50 pounds a year because the Royal Society won't have anything to do with the journal, and the Royal Society won't pay him. He's the corresponding secretary. He handled all of the email and Twitter accounts for the Royal Society. And so Isaac Newton submits a letter on optics, very reluctantly, but he does. And Henry Oldenburg is delighted and puts it on the front page. And what happens at that point is one of the worst experiences of Isaac Newton's life. Because what happens when he publishes that letter is for 4 years he is assaulted by people's comments. He receives a kind of avalanche of concerned notices from people asking him to explain how he slit the blind, how far was the prism placed from the blind, and he had to explain and give an account of himself, and he never published another article. And after 4 years he refused any further to engage in that correspondence. That he had to give an account of his work he was not comfortable with. That he had to be responsible for his ideas and how those ideas were affecting the world, and he said no more. He did not publish again. And so the good news is that many of the people in this room have published more articles than Isaac Newton. And so I don't want you to leave this conference without feeling good about yourself. I don't want to set the bar too high for the graduate students here in terms of moving forward, but I do want you to have a very carefully worked out agenda in terms of your research. Thank you.
So, thank you. I mean, you're a hard act to follow, but does anybody want to respond? Yeah, including, I know I said I wouldn't pick on our international visitors, but we do want to also not exclude you if you have a comment, closing thought, response to John. Just critique of John. Tell us how wonderful our graduate and former graduate students are. Anybody else? Or to the agenda, that's just, I wonder if people agree with John's agenda. That we're setting the agenda. I don't think about that a little longer, but it seems quite provocative that.
There'll be lunch soon.
Oh, here. Seriously.
It's not really a response to anybody except to say, Jennifer, you did a fabulous job of summarizing what you said. But other people are also thinking, boy, you did a great job. It's not really so much about the, where it is, I guess, a little bit connected to John's thing about the agenda. And it's just only because I happen to be going to an ARA meeting tomorrow and just thought, I wonder, I don't know if this is at all possible, but it wouldn't be great to somehow, put some kind of Canadian stamp on that event. And I'm not sure whether or not there's something within this group where, I have no idea what structure it might take, but it just seems to me there is this very interesting event that's going to be happening next year with ARA, and there's some very interesting work here, and it's happening in Vancouver. So I just thought, well, somewhere we should be, it seems to be making some connection. I'm not quite sure how what, but it would be wonderful to kind of put a little bit of a Canadian stamp on that event, and just throw that out.
We're expecting the president and the chair at our 1G society.
Oh.
Be thinking about it between now and
Because I
Lots of wine.
those are really important points, I think, for why they have selected Vancouver, why they selected Canada, and, you know, what they're expecting, but also, you know, if we can infuse what we might, desire. I think, you know, in relation to, we talked about international, Canadian international work, Indigenous work, Aboriginal work, and just Canadian work, you know, how Canadian new literacies can have a presence, so I think that's a really important thing.
I just wonder how Canadian, you know, is what makes it Canadian, the kind of work that we're doing. Because the global part of it is easy. How local is the local part? How national is the local part? How does it shift between Vancouver and Edmonton and Montreal or St. John's? Does that matter? Are our institutions so distinctive that we have a Canadian situation? I mean, we don't have the American oppressive no child left behind kind of approach, and we don't have some of these British notions of, you know, whatever it is, let's slice and dice it and serve it up with some numbers. Is that enough to make what we have to say distinctive, or does it make it less relevant in national terms of we have constraints here, but the constraints, it seems to me, are less in Canada than elsewhere? Does that give us some freedom to explore some of this stuff? Or does it mean that this is very nice for us in our little backwater, but we can't speak to the rest of the world who are under greater constraints than we are? And is it an important question at all? Does it matter? Should we just be getting on with the general new literacies or new literacies wherever they are?
It seems like it keeps coming back to audience.
Yeah.
Who do we want this work to speak to? Where do we want to take it? We want multiple levels of audience?
I would pitch it differently. I would actually pitch it in terms of need. What I guess in John's terms, what value would you add by saying that we could collectively form a voice that would be sort of somewhat Canadian? And what need would that serve in terms of speaking to policy, in terms of speaking to various governments, you know, because we're not nationalized. So would that give us more room as in terms of development of a voice to speak to provincial governments, that kind of thing? And then also collectively in terms of the development of competencies across the country that would leverage our graduate students in some way that was meaningful if we had some kind of collective voice. And so for me it would be those two kinds of things that would be really important in terms of driving this. And I think that the third thing that no one has talked about, but I actually think in some way does speak to John's value point, is that a lot of the work that people have talked about here, some of which I heard and some of which I didn't, actually was driven by a desire on one hand to change the working conditions of teachers in schools, the practices of students that are available to them that aren't just the kind of really heavy-handed reading and writing, print-based literacy practices, to give people other options to enter into this kind of discourse of a knowledge discourse that includes really different modalities. And I think that we saw a lot of that, and that's driven by, I think, in some sense, a working towards changing these very difficult conditions under which teachers are you know, too busy, under-resourced, and under professionally developed, without enough time to do the kinds of development that they want to do.
Sorry, I think it's, forgive me, but I think it's absolutely imperative to have some sense of the local in that sense, because I think one of the specious claims of digital literacy is its universalism, whereas absolutely what sort of Maston, for example, I think we were talking about yesterday, is all literacy practice is situated practice. but the literature of digital literacy, because of our wider community, is often internationalized. And I think it's actually, it encourages a sloppiness at a scholarly level, and it also effaces real and very, very important differences. So I do think continuously that a lot of the discussion about, quote, digital literacies is really some form of way of articulating what happens in your classrooms here, in a way, because and that is not the same as what happens in other classrooms around the country in that kind of way. So I think actually digital literacy is going to have its own kind of local flavour in that kind of way. And I would imagine if I was Shirk, besides wanting to change its name, that absolutely what you'd want to do is to find a way of articulating a progressive project that can make a difference within the kind of the national here in that kind of way. And I think so much of the, we talked a little bit about the MacArthur project, which is obviously very well resourced, but has its own particular national agenda, quite frankly. And we haven't had a period in time, I think John will probably know more about this than me, historically, where digital literacy has this kind of claim to a global universalism.
Well, except for Latin.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
But the reference to my age is appreciated.
It's your wisdom, John.
Oh,
I think what Margaret initiated and what Jen took up so well is really important, and I would frame it as a kind of resistance. We don't have, as Margaret pointed out, the accountability agendas of elsewhere. And the more we resist that, I think the better. And when I read some of the agenda of the Fraser Institute and how that's influencing the political climate here in BC and elsewhere, and when I think about the kinds of testing protocols that we have that are right now not so bad, but can lead to much worse. These new literacies are, and this is something I've been trying to write about, is that assessment practices for new literacies have to be very different, and we have to resist a growing encroachment back to bubble tests and all of those kinds of things that are so antithetical to new literacies. So I'm not saying that it's all about assessment, but that we need to frame perhaps new literacies as something that is different and something that we want to value and something that is not going to survive in this kind of accountability climate. We're not going to thrive in an accountability climate.
Oh, well, I really didn't want to have to say this, but as much as I really enjoyed the little bits that I saw, I would just hope that the next conference would be a bit more diverse in terms of maybe whose voices aren't here, as you talked about a voice, that we really aren't one voice, we are many voices, and there are voices that are not here that really could be here. So it's just, it's hard for me to say because obviously I'm the only black person in the room, but that I know of anyway, but that's just something that was just sort of a constant thing that I was saying to myself, like next time, hopefully we can think about who's not here that could be here that would contribute, even though I acknowledge that people are doing all kinds of work that brings in all kinds of issues around class and nationality, culture, gender, sexuality, all kinds of things, but just that, the next time.
It kind of ties in a little way. I was just thinking as Julian was speaking about digital literacies, and for me in the way that I've been thinking about it anyway, actually opens up possibilities for those multiple representations and honoring and respecting difference in ways that I feel like so much of the standards movement has been trying to shut down. And so I feel like, you know, some of the work that we're doing is a means of opening those things up again and making them visible. And maybe in the making of them visible, it would be a little harder for policymakers to ignore and try to, you know, uniform, it's not the right word, but you know what I mean, so, yeah, standardize. Because maybe from the Ontario context, I do still feel that the accountability measures are thwarting a lot of our teachers. And, you know, in one province, we've got so much diversity that it's ridiculous. Even in my own school board, we were a test site for the Canadian Testing Services when they would create their little pilot tests, because we had so much diversity within one little board. And I don't think they ever successfully created tests that were good for all students. And so I think that, you know, it's up to us to sort of use these tools to continually express and show and represent the diversity that is Canada in ways that are so rich that they can't ignore it.
I think that's extremely important in terms of not only, I talk as educator, teacher educator, and researcher, but as parent to the 4-year-old with special needs who has syndrome, who goes to the television when we turn it on and grabs the screen and tries to move things around on the screen. So he is someone who is at risk of going into a system that will broadcast and define in terms of normalcy, in terms of labeling, and when we talk about diversity and whose voices are here and who we need to advocate for, and who has possibilities of self-advocating in relation to systems that we see disjuncts on a continual basis. I'd like to add that perspective and voice as well, and talk about, and write about, and speak about, and represent the possibilities of who he will be. And realize when we talk about Canada, that I have a colleague who goes to Ukraine, and there my son would be institutionalized and suppressed in terms of who he could be. But from literacies, in terms of service that John's talking about, is another aspect of giving voice.
What I have to say doesn't really follow very nicely at all from what James just said, but it comes from what Margaret was saying about what it means to be Canadian. And it struck me that, you know, all of us were coming from different parts of the country, and each of us brought our own research. But we haven't really had a chance to start taking people from various parts of the country, coming together and doing studies on similar types of questions, and just looking at how our contexts influence, you know, how literacies look, and how our research might look in various parts of the country. And it really came home to me when I was doing this study of teachers across the country. So Jill McClay and I from the University of Alberta interviewed 216 teachers from one coast to the other, from coast to coast to coast. And you know, even the time zones, trying to figure out when to call the teachers and so on, really gave us a greater sense of the country. And then asking questions about, you know, how does your context influence the way you teach writing and so on. And so I'm wondering if part of the value added is indeed that we think about an audience, as broad an audience as possible for the work that we have done. But maybe another part of the value added could be that we start making connections so that we're starting to work together across the country, so that we're not just working within our provinces. And in that way, we come to understand what it makes us Canadian as well, because we come to understand various, you know, what's happening across the country.
I was just going to build on what Shelley was saying, because I was sitting here thinking, what is Canadian? You know, I'm sitting beside Vic, and I know Vic from doing work in the UK, and I've lived in the States, and I think part of it actually also goes back to what Annette was saying, because one of the things I found in the States they did incredibly well was look at race
and be transparent about race and culture. Then when I think about Canadians, I think Canadians are very good about thinking about regionality. Right? And I sort of think I'm in greedy old Ontario, and there's Eastern Canada and Western Canada, and that regionality is very strong I think in Canadian work. So when we think about what do we privilege in terms of our nationality and our research, I think that would be an important question when you think about what would a Canadian kind of symposium say. I think it would have regional representation, but I think you also need the devil's advocate. Actually, you need someone from the States and someone from the UK to be able to say, here are some other perspectives to create conflict in that. Does that make any sense at all? I mean, I just think you have to think about what does it mean to be Canadian? What is a Canadian perspective exactly?
Or for example, somebody from Canada who is actually looking at those issues. I mean, I think there's so many people in your department and your faculty, Jen, you know, who, and there are people here too, of course, but, so I think, and it's just, I don't want to say normal, I hate that word so much, but it's just, you know, that we have, well, we used the word affinity groups today. So in terms of our research, you know, we have affinity groups, and we may have to work a little harder to think outside of our affinity groups for research, or the kinds of perspectives that we like. So, because I think there are a lot of people who are really, in fact, that's my agenda at that May 18th meeting at AERA tomorrow, is to say, okay, you need to have X, Y, and Z. You need a presidential panel with X, Y, and Z, because they've done groundbreaking work in terms of race and language in Canada, or in terms of, you know, kids from the Caribbean, or in terms of African immigrants, or, you know, just so that they get a sense of Vancouver, but also Canada, you know, on a larger scale. So I agree with you, but I think also people are here as well.
The one caveat is that I'm thinking about new literacies. So if I go to a new literacies conference in the States, a new literacies conference in South Africa, a new literacies conference in the UK, different things are privileged in relation to the digital. So I find a pattern within the digital is somewhat, maybe not necessarily, is looking at regionality in terms of Canada. And it would be helpful to kind of build on how other people are interpreting digital. Does that make sense? So I'm sort of thinking in terms of.
For me, the issue of, for me, the issue is not so much what does it mean to be Canadian. That is not the central question for me. It's more what, by virtue of having this Canadian space, what kind of work gets produced. So, because I think if you ask the question, what does it mean to be Canadian, I think you go down like a really dark mirror. But I think if you ask, what does it mean to live in this kind of society, and you know, the nature of the space, which is, as you say, partly the regionality, partly the diversity and so forth, partly the funds that we happen to get from SHIRT and various things. What does that mean for our production and the nature of our work, and what we can produce? I think that for me becomes a really interesting question, and then how do we draw on that? And I suppose I'm thinking, you know, and I keep thinking of, you know, of titles, you know, and I think space, I think, is an interesting, space and identity for me are always like very interesting questions. So because the notion of space captures not only the local, but also the global and the regional. So for me, that's an interesting theme. You know, it seems to me that one could kind of work around and identities really in relation to those spaces. But I do think that, you know, the central question is, what is it that we have in Canada? And interesting, Jen, you've just come from the States, so you know you've probably got that very perspective. What is it about a different context that lends itself to different certain kinds of practices, right? So it's very interesting to see what kind of practices we find by virtue of the resources that we have in Canada and the nature of the space that we inhabit. So just and the people, of course, you know, they inhabit that space. So just some thoughts.
I'd like to say something about this one as well. Because Jen and I, when we were doing game study stuff, we decided we would make up something called Canadian Game Studies. And people, we got always really cool, like, what do you mean? So we intentionally talked about snowmobiles and polar bears and, you know, snowshoes. And it was ironic because there is no such thing as Canadian Game Studies, but we created an association and we created a journal and we have now critical mass. And I would argue that
I would like to say about Canadianism, what John said about new literacies. It's you're not ever going to discover it. and if you try, we'll be that small town. What it is it's an opening for imagination, and for imagination with purpose, what John was talking about. So what do we want to do? Let's use this kind of imaginary space of Canadianism to say, you know, we have a big agenda here, we have things that need to be done, this is how we're defining this field, these are the priorities, and this is what defines Canadian, you know, new literacies. It's kind of just making it up, but making it up because we have very good reasons to make this up that no one else is making up in this way. And so, yeah.
I'd like to ask if Canadians are always such nice people.
No.
And from my own experience, South Africans, we laugh at what we don't like to identify ourselves as South African particularly, but also that we make progress by disagreeing with each other, by looking for differences and making them into sites of work and establishing some theoretical, conceptual disagreements and getting some work, putting ourselves under pressure to clarify our position in relation to others. And it seems to me that the digital literacy project would benefit from perhaps a bit of identifying some differences in direction and position, and perhaps exaggerating those and working on those and picking a few fights with each other. Just a thought.
So I've been tasked with bringing this session to a close, but I wanted to say something about process as part of that. So this, as we've been saying, this is a conversation that got started 2 years ago now, and Kathy Sanford started that conversation and with Teresa Rogers, and then I think Teresa came and knocked on my door, and the three of us started to put this together. We contacted a whole range of different people across Canada who we thought were doing interesting work in new literacies. During that time period of 2 years, those participants shifted a bit. There were some changes. There were people we invited in as keynotes that couldn't come a year later, and so the group of people that comes together here, this is it's somewhat coincidental, circumstantial, but this is we see this as a sort of a start of a conversation. We hope that through some struggles, through some common sharing of values, thinking about regional possibilities, thinking about new research possibilities, that it goes somewhere. It adds new voices to the conversation. That it's an organic process. I don't know where it will go. But we hope to continue the conversation through, we've got the blog, we're trying to document some things. Are there some possible publications that might come out of it? We're thinking about, maybe a special issue in a Canadian journal, the Language and Literacy Journal, an edited volume. How might we add other voices to that aren't represented here? So I think that it's, I see it really just as a conversation that sort of got started 2 years ago. We've had this opportunity to come face to face, to see, I look around and I know people's work, but I may not necessarily have known them face to face. And so I think it's been a great opportunity, and I hope that there's a synergy. It might not be a common voice, but there may be some little groups that form and some things that come out of this that wouldn't have come out otherwise. And it's this group of people. Had it been a different set of voices, it might be a different agenda, it might be a different way forward. But I sort of see this as a moment in time, a moment in our history as language and literacy researchers doing work in new literacies. And it's, as John said, up to us to
figure out how to move forward with that. And we'll leave it at that. So we greatly appreciate your willingness to join us in this conversation, and look forward to seeing who we can fight with and what we can do with this. I like the idea of fighting.
Yeah, just add something to that. I mean, I think that the whole notion of a new literacy summit began in 2006
Yeah.
with Bobby Hammett and
No, it's a continuing
So
conversation.
yeah, so I
Yeah.
wondered how we could maybe bring
Yeah.
in some taking stock of where we were and Jill McClay as well. I think where we were there, what we accomplished in that setting way across the country on the other coast, how we move forward in terms of taking stock and fighting our battles or whatever it is we're going to do. Just historical perspective.
I just was doing a little tally around the room, and it's just about exactly a third of the people here were in St. John's 5 years ago, which is interesting in itself. This is a bigger group than we have in St.
Change, a lot of
John's.
change. That whole discussion has moved in quite interesting ways, so it'll be interesting to see. How many did you have?
Well, it was 25 shirt paid for plus a few locals. I don't know if it was much more than 30 people.
So we're not much more than here.
No.
Yeah. They limit the size.
Yeah, they do.
Lunchtime?
Lunch.
Thank you.
Lunch.
We can take
If you want to go for a walk on the beach,